Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. And what a pleasure it is to be here on the last day of CogX to talk about the environment, talk about business, talk about the economy, talk about technology, and to do it all with a very special guest, none other than the CEO of Microsoft. That's right, the Chief Environmental Officer of Microsoft, Lucas Joppa. Now, Lucas has a great history. He comes to technology from the environmental sciences. He studied wildlife ecology and zoology as an undergraduate, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, a place whose environment is really quite critical to their survival and one that's being jeopardized. Then I went to Duke and got a PhD in ecology, founded a company, so he knows that journey as well, called Earth Audit, which was specializing in using predictive analytics to understand the planet and some of the features of it in terms of what will happen to it over time if we continue on the path that we're doing. And he got recruited to Microsoft to lead their efforts in terms of the environment. Now you're probably thinking, wait a minute, why isn't this guy in public service working for the government or some research lab doing environmental stuff? Why is he at Microsoft doing it? Good question. So that's going to be our first question to Lucas. Lucas, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me here. So I've been looking forward to this. I would rather be sitting on a stage next to you, but I'm happy we're able to make this work. And look, you know, the reason why is because I have always tried to figure out ways that I can be the most additional to the world. And I guess when I looked at, you know, when I got done with my academic studies and was looking around, you know, I could have gone into academia, but I felt like so many people just like me were already doing that. And I could have gone into public service, and I thought that so many people like me were already doing that. And so I looked around, and it seemed like one of the few things that people like me weren't necessarily doing were going into the tech sector and really trying to affect change in one of the industries and one of the sectors that's growing the most rapidly and having some of the most profound impact on our economy and our society. So I thought, there's a big lever. I don't know if I can pull it, but if I can get my hand on it and start hanging from it for a while, maybe, just maybe, you know, we can start to make the world a better place. So that's what we've been working on.
Okay, now I can understand that you have this Archimedes lever at Earth Audit as a startup in which you can try to change the world by sort of trying to understand with data how the planet's going to transform. But Microsoft, I know all about Microsoft.
Yeah.
Microsoft sells packaged software. Microsoft is a cloud provider. Microsoft acquired LinkedIn. Why does Microsoft have a chief environmental officer?
Well, look, first, this isn't new for us. I actually joined Microsoft about 10 years ago, and my remit was to think about the future of the intersection of environmental science and computer science in 50 years out. Right. So I think a lot of people think about Microsoft as, you know, a staid kind of, technology old timer. And I think, you know, in some ways that's true. But in other ways, we have been investing in research and innovation in so many different areas, environment being just one of them. So, you know, one of the interesting things, though, that you immediately realize, particularly when you're in a corporate research lab, is just how difficult it is to think 50 years out. And that's not because it's hard to have big ideas. It's because when you sit in an organization or an institution with all of these resources and other people thinking the way that you are, as soon as you've had a thought, it's almost like the Schrodinger's cat kind of issue of intellectual pursuits. As soon as you've had the thought, it's not 50 years anymore. It's probably more like 30 because you're thinking about it, which means that there's a much higher probability that it's going to happen. And so we saw that. We were trying to think 50 years out, and it turns out in a little bit less than 10 years, we ended up going from pure research to integrating sustainability through the lens of our core competencies of software engineering across our entire business, which is partly what we announced in January as part of a new strategy that Microsoft's bringing out or starting to play out on the topic of sustainability.
So let me stop you right there. Like, how would you, even if you, I'd love to know what your vision is 50 years out, both probably a set of scenarios, optimistic and pessimistic and dystopian. Perhaps the Goldilocks approach will get the pessimistic Not the worst, not the best.
Yeah.
We'll see. But in addition to that, when you say that you're thinking about 50 years out for Microsoft, so then what can you do now? How would that, before I find out what your scenarios are, how would you feed that back in to Microsoft? Like, what would they like? Would you work on better power consumption of phones systems so that you can Zoom players or PlayStation so that you can sort of reduce your carbon footprint that way? I mean, certainly the data center would be one. I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, so data centers, of course, are hugely important. And remember, when I was starting 10 years ago, Microsoft Azure, Microsoft's cloud was kind of an idea we were having. I remember meeting Satya, our real CEO, before he was a real CEO. He led our Azure data center team, and I remember thinking, oh, what an amazing guy. It's almost too bad that he's in charge of Azure, right? Because it's not important enough. And now we see, how fast 10 years can go. But look, I see things like our data centers as supporting infrastructure for the broader, business model that we have, which is really affecting digital transformation of organizations and entire sectors. And I look at it through the lens of, probably the biggest, most socio and economically important sector that there ever has been and that there is today. So many people focus on the tech sector, but in my mind, it's really the natural resource sector. It's where our food, our energy, our fiber, and all of the materials that make all of the things, including our shelter, come from. And a recognition that the digital transformation that so many of us have experienced through the smartphones in our pockets, the digital payment devices that we all rely on every day, that transformation hasn't really been as significant in the way that we monitor, model, and then ultimately manage Earth's natural resources. And I think that that's hugely exciting from a tech perspective for two reasons. One, because it's what the world needs to do. We need to get way better at those 3 M's of monitoring, modeling, and managing. And digital transformation and technological approaches have the potential to accelerate that. So that's good for the planet. It's also a very large sector that the tech sector needs to start focusing on as a business opportunity, right? And so, we talk a lot in private sector about win-wins and win-win-wins and all of these things. I think one of the reasons we talk about them so often is because they're so rare, actually. But I think in this space, it's why I chose to come to Microsoft and the tech sector more broadly, is because I actually do believe there's a win-win here.
So describe to me what you're doing. Or describe, what is Microsoft? What is its ambition? Actually, before we find out what Microsoft's ambition is, maybe lay out what you see is going to happen in 50 years' time. Like, what is the vision that you brought to the board of directors and to the executive team that you said, okay, boys and girls, take a really strong drink, because I'm going to tell you right now things that you don't want to hear.
Yeah, well, look, the things no one wants to hear are the scientific facts of the matter, which is that if we don't act rapidly to get out ahead of our climate and broader environmental challenges, we are going to suffer some of the most significant socio and economic damages and cultural damages that the human species has ever seen. I think, one of the things that really was powerful for me, and I'm a scientist, so I've been studying this stuff for a long time, is just the level of clarity that I think a report from the IPCC, a special report, the special report on climate change of 1.5 that was published about a year and a half ago, really brought. It's relative from IPCC standards, is a relatively short report, but it really hit home. It said a few things. One, that climate change is real. It's advancing rapidly. That every degree Celsius is not created equal, that there is not a linear relationship between the social and economic damages that the human species will experience for every half a degree. So saying, oh, well, we might not hit 1.5 degrees, we'll hit 2, that's fine. That there's a massive nonlinear gap between those things. And then that there's really no credible economic model that sees us achieving a 1.5 degree future without some form of overshoot of our carbon budget and then a need to withdraw carbon from the atmosphere. So those were kind of the hard facts, you know, the trillions of dollars of economic damages, the massive social disruption that would occur. The things people do want to hear about, though, are what you can do about it. And that's really, I think, where Microsoft got excited.
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, you see that I think the debate is really bifurcating into those people who say, whoa, like, if we're going to actually respond to climate change, we really have to basically put a halt to capitalism and think about something new. And then you have these other people on the other side that say, whoa, if we're really going to get serious about responding to climate change, we better use all the fruits of capitalism and what it provides us to actually marshal a plan against this. Now, both people have the exact same goal in mind. They both spring from both science and values, but they frame the problem differently and they come to completely different solutions. And one would argue, I mean, I would argue that you actually need the inventive step of technology and finance of capitalism as a motor to respond to all the ails and pathologies of capitalism for the last 200 years, last 140 years. So what are those innovations that you also imagine that the IPCC report actually is mute on, because they're not tasked with that. They're scientists, not visionaries, but you work for a company that's a technology company that's visionary. What are those innovations that you see out on the horizon that are going to help us respond to climate change?
Yeah, and look, I'm not here to say which of those two models is right or wrong. I'm just pretty convinced which one has the higher probability of actually playing out in reality. And I think that you know, those that look at the capitalist system and say that it's broken and incapable of addressing the challenge that we have today, I think are wrong. I think they are wrong in the sense, particularly when they're saying that it's incapable of addressing the challenges that we face today. You know, capitalism and the markets that we know today, they work because we make them work. And we make them work in the direction we want them to travel in. And so, sure, things may be broken today in the sense that we're not directing our current system towards the types of outcomes that we would like to achieve. But that doesn't mean that it can't happen. And I think if you look just, for instance, at what Microsoft is doing and why it's a good example of what's possible as a publicly traded company, you know, that really looks after the pursuit of profit through the solving of problems of people in the planet, then you start to see where we're going to and why. I think, you know, and I'll get to the specific innovations that you asked about in a second, but one of my favorite quotes of Satya this year was when he was saying that, you know, when you're a company at the scale of Microsoft, for us to do well, we need the world to do well. And that's where I think ultimately capitalism works. Because if you have large enough, successful enough companies that can see across beyond a 2-year time horizon, beyond a quarterly earnings time horizon, beyond a 2-year time horizon, out to the long arc of history that they hope to encompass and help define, then that sort of thinking that says for us to do well, we need the world to do well, becomes paramount, and it becomes baked into your corporate DNA. And if you believe that, then you must understand that for the world to do well, and thus for you to do well, we need to do a significantly better job in addressing our environmental challenges. Okay, so that's kind of that's kind of the high level. The question is, what does every organization have to do, right? Well, in my perspective, every organization needs to bring what they do best, their core corporate competency, right, to the problem. Microsoft's a software, technology company. We build robust and scalable software systems, and increasingly the physical infrastructure that software uses to do its job. So what can we do? Well, I think we can do a bunch of things. We can start with the way that our business is built, run, and operated. The data centers that support all of the software that we run. And ensuring that those are built in accordance with what the best available science says we need to do. And one of the things, particularly when you look at the largest resource consumption area of data centers, is around electricity. And the unfortunate fact that so much of the world's electricity still comes from high carbon emission sources, that the grids that our data centers plug into are nowhere near green. And so what we're doing is moving our entire business, including our data center business, to 100% renewable energy by 2025. And a lot of
is that even possible? Like, how would you possibly do? I mean, you must be over. Like, let me sort of try to unpack this and develop this. If you were to try to do this, you would have to pay more for electricity. You'd therefore be less competitive than your rivals who are trying to sell, say, hosted services, etc. And your shareholders would earn less money. You have to take a really heavy dose of sort of broad-heartedness in a capitalist system to swallow that. I mean, how do you physically, and also, where do you buy it from? Is there even enough for you? Because you're such a large energy consumer.
Yeah, so think about it. I think, again, if you take a pure quarterly view of the world, you're right. I think if you take a longer, more holistic view of the world, inclusive of the diversity of stakeholders that matter and give us license to operate in this economy, then you're wrong. I think that for us, this goes much deeper. Actually, if we kind of dig down on what are you actually doing and how does that make sense? I mean, just that 100% renewable electricity part, that's part of a broader commitment that we announced in January to be carbon negative by 2030. And I'm going to just go into the details for a quick second because it pertains to the broader question that you are asking about how do you economically make this work. And so that carbon negative commitment is because of what the IPCC says, that the world needs to move to a net zero carbon economy by 2050. Okay, well, if we're going to do that, how are we going to do it? Well, every individual and organization is going to have to do everything they possibly can to do it. We believe that those organizations that have more should do more. And so we choose to go carbon negative because we know that not everybody's going to be able to get to even net zero. And so those companies that can go below zero should, to provide a buffer to those who can't. So the second bit, though, is we asked, well, what's carbon negative? And we actually decided to take a historical perspective on this and to say that for us, for Microsoft, it means that we're going to reduce our emissions by half or more, and we're going to remove the rest. And then we're not going to just stop going a little bit below zero. Between 2030 and 2050, we're going to continue to remove carbon from the atmosphere, both on an annual basis, but also at a level great enough to, over the course of those years, account for all of the emissions associated with Microsoft business activities since we were founded in 1975. And we're going to do that through basically two financial levers that we have at our disposal. It's what I call the fee and the fund, right? So we have internally a carbon fee, a real price on carbon, not a shadow price just used to, kind of de-risk our future business decisions, but a price that every business unit pays today for emitting carbon. And we can use this price, the structure of that price, to incentivize people to make different decisions. And so when we think about renewable energy, for instance, the cost of purchasing that renewable energy, well, we've structured the price such that if you are purchasing energy, non-renewable energy, it's going to cost you more to do that than to just purchase renewable energy, because you'll have to purchase that energy and pay the carbon fee. If you purchase renewable energy, then you are provided relief from that fee. So that provides the incentivization. That's why we can go to 100% renewable by 2025 so quickly, is because we've put that guardrail in place. But we've also put in place a different financial mechanism, a fund, a climate innovation fund. It's $1 billion investment fund that we are using predominantly to invest in carbon reduction removal technologies. The reason we're doing that is because of your second question. Is there enough of this stuff? And is there enough of it at the price that you want to pay? And so the answer is no. If you're looking at what the IPCC says we need to do, which is remove carbon, reduce and remove carbon, the cost of doing those two things is still prohibitively high for many organizations. So we have a fund that we're deploying outside of our four walls to go and help build those markets to drive down the cost.
Okay, let me see if I get this right. For the fee, you're just acting enlightened. Interesting that Microsoft's doing it. Where's Google? Where's Facebook? Let's talk about that. Right. So it seems like it's like a forcing function to say, hey, stake in the ground, everyone. You can do this too, but maybe you should step up and do it.
Yeah.
But for the fund, $1 billion is a lot of money. I can appreciate the fact that Microsoft has a core competence in building robust and scalable software. Does it have a competence in actually adjudicating its shareholders, or let's leave that aside, $1 billion well, so that it can actually invest in these carbon removal technologies? And it begs the question from an economic standpoint, from a business standpoint, management standpoint, why would you want a company to be the agent of investment in these technologies? Why wouldn't you just point to best-in-class venture capitalists or advisors who say, who can adjudicate a marketplace and its terrain in terms of where you should have new innovations, and you become the customer of that rather than the investor of it? Does it bring you anything more to be the investor in these companies rather than simply purchase their technologies for the purpose of carbon removal? And I can actually add to that, which is to say, Stripe recently has announced that they're going to be the first customer of some of these carbon removal companies. And that's really interesting. But of course, what's so fascinating as well is that the numbers that they're talking about of removing carbon is really, really low. So because you can see it's just a very embryonic space at the moment.
Yeah.
So please.
Yeah. And look, let's get back to Stripe. I think what Stripe's doing is amazing. But the numbers are small, right? They announced all of that was $1 million kind of purchasing agreement, which is fantastic for every organization to be thinking about doing what they can. But at the scale of the problem, I think, and even a Microsoft, we're a drop in the bucket of the problem and our financial ability to contribute to the solution. So you've got to think really strategically about the way that you deploy your capital, which is one of your questions. I think the most powerful way to be a catalyst in this space is to be both a customer and an investor, because it allows you to set internally both to be able to help modify the system, deliver market signal and market demand at the same time, right? And so while we're out investing, we're also buying. That's happening right now, right, as we speak. And so this isn't a, hey, in 2030, we're going to need to do this, or, whatever. We're actually going to go out and invest, and we're going to purchase at the same time. That allows us to get really smart about the market, about what market availability is, what fluidity is, what capacity is, what cost structures are. Because what we want to be able to do is to be a participant in our own rescue, right? We don't want to have to pay the price that current carbon removal comes in at today. We don't want to pay that today. We definitely don't want to pay it in 2030 or 2050. We will, but we don't want to. And we don't want to because anytime you can pay less money, that's good. But also, we don't want to because we know so few other organizations have the resources that we do. So, if we're going to make this about more than just us, then we have to play the game in the way that we are. To your point about why direct investments versus, leaning on, existing funds with their expertise, advisors, et cetera, that plays a significant part in our deployment strategy. You'll see our portfolio as we start to announce things, leaning on the expertise of those who know the most in this space. So, yeah.
Now, I spoke several years ago. I spoke to a senior manager at Microsoft at a private retreat, and the person was talking about the Digital Geneva Convention, which is this initiative that Microsoft put forward, which is to say, hey, cyberspace is an unruly place, and it doesn't look too dissimilar to the situation that we had where we, after the First World War, where we didn't actually have the rules of warfare that all nations could agree upon, that if we were going to have this regrettable thing called warfare, that we need certain things like treatment of prisoners of war, et cetera, how we would sort of manage that, what constitutes a prisoner of war. And so the person said, it's not that we have all the answers, but we felt that we needed a forcing function. And that was the term that the person told me, a forcing function for the rest of the industry, to say, we're going to put this out here, and we've got a piece of paper, we're going to wave it, and you can like it and get behind us or join hands with us, lock arms shoulder to shoulder, or you can criticize it, but you can't ignore it because it's here, it's there now. And it was a quote unquote a forcing function. So it sounds to me like you are doing something similar for the technology industry to lay out a vision to say, hey, this is possible. We can do this. Here's what we're doing. I'm not sure we have all the right answers, but this is one model. Where's yours? Right. So you pose the question, do you have doppelgangers at other companies in Silicon Valley and perhaps a large retailer in Seattle near you? Yeah. And if not, what is it going to take for others to see what you're doing and to say, okay, we should probably do something similar too?
Well, I think the tech sector in general has been providing leadership in certain ways on environmental sustainability issues. Microsoft's commitments are exceptional, but so is the work that our peers at companies like Apple and Google and Amazon have been making. So, I think we all see different interpretations of the same future. I think one of the things that everyone should understand when they're thinking about questions about shareholders and value, et cetera, is these are physical systems that we're dealing with. These are physical systems that are changing. Our maybe political systems or our social systems may not be changing at the same speed, and they may not be changing in a uniform fashion, but they are changing and they will change. And so when you think about instituting a price on carbon inside Microsoft, look, one way or another, there's going to be a price on carbon. At least in many of the major geographies, there already is where we operate. Wouldn't you want to get out ahead of that? Wouldn't you want to reduce, right? Wouldn't you want to do those things?
Now, Lucas, this is going to be the perfect place for us to pick up the conversation when we bring it open and opened it up to all of the attendees who are listening, who can ask you questions as well. So what we're going to have to do now is draw this part of the session to a close and open it up to the Q&A in just a second. And back to you.
Thank you, Kenneth and Lucas, for a fantastic panel. As Kenneth mentioned, if you want to continue this discussion, please keep posting your questions on Slido and head over, if you have the correct ticket type, to the CogX virtual platform where you can join the Q&A session for this panel. It will not be streamed on YouTube. Meanwhile, join me back here on this stage at 6 p.m. UK time for the last session of the day on this stage, featuring Exponential View's Azim Azar in conversation with Juan Carlos Castillo Rubio about an inclusive bioeconomy. I'll see you then.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.